Jack Smith gets scolded by Representative Luna. She says, "Did you even consider presidential immunity before you tried to indict Donald Trump?" Probably not. Her letter goes into it, but she's also scolding him because he didn't respond. She sent the letter to Jack Smith specifically, and he had one of his underlings do the writing back. And she says, "I'm irritated about this." Representative from Congress, Paulina Luna, says, "My colleagues and I, we have grave constitutional concerns about the appointment of Jack Smith. That's why I am demanding answers from him." And he has 9 days to respond. Clock is ticking. We'll see what she does when he doesn't. But here is the letter that went over to him from Paulina Luna. She's over in Florida. From the House of Representatives, sent this to Jack Smith, the so-called special counsel. Some people say he's illegally constituted. He's illegally appointed. The J6 committee's illegally constituted. It's hard to keep track of all the illegal entities around here. But this is what they write. "Dear Mr. Jack, we are in receipt of a letter that you sent back to us, but for some reason it came from this guy, Carlos Uriarte." She said, "That's pretty weird, because although our letter was directed to you, it's unclear whether the department or Mr. Uriarte provided you with our letter or whether you were consulted in their response. So he sent us a letter, but we don't know if your input was there." So both the department's response from Carlos and the DOJ underscore why we need congressional oversight, saying neither the American people nor Congress have any insight, Jack, into whether your actions have been subject to any oversight, whether they're congressional or otherwise. And although Carlos and his correspondence refers to the regulations that, quote, permit the AG to request that the special counsel provide an explanation for any investigative or prosecutorial step your office may take in regulations that we cited to you, buddy, that Uriarte does not address whether any such oversight has in fact occurred. So we were asking about whether oversight has in fact occurred. You just said that it can occur. Like you said, well, it's permitting this and this is what could happen. And so we don't care about that. We know the rules. Did it happen or not? Now, we are unpersuaded by the DOJ and your reference to the long-standing protections of confidentiality. They say, yeah, there is historical precedent, for congressional oversight of a purportedly independent prosecution. And he's not independent. He's a special counsel, not an independent prosecutor. Specifically in the regulations that were promulgated by Robert Bork back in 1973, when he appointed Leon Jaworski back during the Watergate scandal, Bork required the congressional consent for any termination of Jaworski, which was an explicit acknowledgement that the DOJ played a critical role and Congress had a critical role in the independent investigation. Okay, so you couldn't get rid of him without the consent of Congress. Our core concern here, though, Jack, is how your office has administered the law, and our legislative function is to assess whether the law has been implemented as intended or whether it requires change. Now, we are confident that we have legislative authority to investigate this here. The functions of the DOJ and the Attorney General are all subject of congressional legislation, and therefore we can inquire, investigating why the DOJ did not initiate prosecutions or why it did in Trump's case would require our office to review your deliberations and to determine your theory of its case. Now, we cannot evaluate these decisions in the abstract, but we have congressional power to examine them. Now, recent actions by your office exacerbate our concern. We're worried that there is no oversight over your investigation, Jack. For example, you wrote in your Supreme Court petition that's in front of the Supreme Court, you said that we have to vindicate the public interest in this case, and that in order to do so, we need an immediate resolution of this immunity issue, which is knocking on the door at the Court of Appeals. We're waiting on a ruling for them, saying that we need to get this decision so we can get the trial back on track. But the criminal justice system is not a vehicle to inform the electorate. It's not what we use the law for. And any such interest that you want to have a trial quickly, that does not overcome the judiciary's interest in ascertaining whether a case is in fact justiciable. So she's asking about immunity and basically, Jack, like, we know you want a trial. What was your process when you decided whether to even bring this case or not? Indeed, as you're no doubt aware, department regulations caution against taking action that could impermissibly interfere with an election. And so your petition to the SCOLDS also is concerning for what it lacks. Apparently, there's no endorsement of the U.S. Solicitor General. Now, as you're undoubtedly aware, the Solicitor General, the person who is actually appointed by the president and is confirmed with advice and consent of the Senate, is responsible for representing the U.S. before SCOTUS. Now, our interest is whether the Solicitor General was consulted is more than semantic. As we articulated previously, your actions reflect that of a, quote, principal officer and not an inferior officer, as Uriarte blanketly contends. And this goes back to that Ed Meese peace issue, the former AG, who says that Jack Smith is acting as somebody who needs to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and he has not. So most recently, even your purported representation, in other words, Jack Smith is illegitimate. He's taking actions as a principal officer and he wasn't appropriately appointed that way. Most recently, even your purported representation of the interest of the American people, that was belied by your position taken in the Court of Appeals. In that argument, James Pierce from your office, he conceded for the first time ever that a former president can enjoy immunity from prosecution while simultaneously claiming that such a question need not be resolved in regards to President Trump. So even though the situation described by Mr. Pierce is nearly identical to that confronted by your prosecution of Trump in the first place. So in other words, your own people say that immunity might apply. Now that key concession contradicts the position that was taken by your office. You said there was no immunity. So at this juncture, the concession reflects an acknowledgement of the important constitutional questions raised by this prosecution. Did you investigate immunity before you brought this case? Did you even make a determination that you were allowed to prosecute before you did? Or did you just race it so quickly because you knew you had to get it done before the election? Accordingly, we need the following information from you, Jack. All documents about your decision and your authority to impanel a grand jury in DC and in Florida. All documents about your authority to offer immunity to people testifying before the jury. All documents and communications about your authority to seek return of an indictment from either a grand jury, and all documents about communications between your office concerning your decision to return an indictment of Trump. We ask for a response no later than February 9th of this year, and we thank you for your prompt attention to this matter. Sincerely, your friends, Anna Paulina Luna. We got Michael Cloud, Marjorie Taylor Greene's in the house, Eric Burlinson, Byron Donalds is here, Lauren Boebert, and Tim Burchett, all signing off on this, demanding some answers from Jack Smith. We'll see what he does. My guess is he doesn't respond to any of it. They send another letter, or maybe the next step is a subpoena, just like the one we saw from Jim Jordan over to Fani Willis. So more pressure on the special counsel's office. This is an exchange of George Conway, who has some Trump problems, is not a fan of him at all. And what's curious about this is they just keep talking about platitudes, or we'll call them demagogues, as suggested. They make up statements that make Trump sound very bad, but a lot of it is mostly meaningless. And we've seen this before. They say Trump's going to undermine the Constitution. Okay, how? Trump's never going to leave office. Okay, he did last time. What's your basis for that? What's your evidence? Trump is going to undermine the Constitution or American democracy, or Trump's an egomaniac, right? He's all about self-aggrandizing. All the language, you know what it is. What's curious about this one is he is referencing the attacks that have been brought by the left as evidence of success. Okay, so it's not even Trump's own statements. It's their attacks that have led to convictions in the case of like a convicted perjurer, Michael Cohen, or like Alan Weisselberg, the CFO. That's the evidence. So it's a sneaky little adjustment. Here's how it sounds.
We've seen numerous circumstances where Trump has gotten people to lie or obstruct justice or perform illegal acts to protect him, even sometimes when he hasn't even asked them to do it. They understand what he wants them to do. I mean, you see all these people who were indicted, including his own chief of staff at the White House in Georgia. We've seen Michael
by Fani Willis, which is totally illegitimate.
Cohen. We've seen
convicted perjurer who's flipped more times than anyone can count.
Weisselberg previously.
Also knocked out by Letitia James, who ran on prosecuting Trump.
It's just Donald Trump is just a cloud of deception.
You see what I'm saying? Like there's nothing there. There's no meaning there.
And he creates a culture of lying and deception and illegality wherever he goes. And if you are...
No, he didn't. You guys did that. Letitia James did that. Fani Willis did that. They're illegitimate, as we've already talked about. So they cite their own track record of lawfare as evidence that Trump is bad.
Are associated with him, you have to be very, very careful. You're taking a risk. I mean, there are lawyers who losing their licenses are threatening.
Because the left is making that happen. Because the 65 Project and other groups are trying to take out the lawyers.
Are being threatened with losing their licenses for defending him. And it never, ever stops with him. He expects people to do illegal things for him.
Crazy, right? So they're leading that prosecution. They can't come up with anything really concrete. So they result to going back to their own lawfare. Like, what is your point? Like, what is the evidence that Trump is going to do something bad? It's the things that they've already attacked him on, right? So they create their own attacks. It's wild. So here's another exchange. Now, this one's, kind of Trumpy, and you always got to question what Roberta Kaplan says. But here is an exchange. We know George Conway, that guy we just heard from, started his own podcast now because they're all Trump podcasters now. They can't do anything else with their lives meaningful. So this is what they turn to. And apparently Roberta Kaplan was on there and Trump said, "I really enjoyed talking to you and I can't wait to see you next Tuesday."
Roberta Kaplan, the lead attorney who helped clinch a whopping $83 million verdict for Trump accuser E. Jean Carroll, Carroll is spilling some serious tea on a podcast with George Conway, who introduced Kaplan, by the way, to E. Jean Carroll.
She did, at a party, and then connected them with Reid Hoffman, who paid for the whole thing.
Kaplan went into juicy detail about what it was like to depose the former president behind closed doors at Mar-a-Lago. Take a listen.
Which is wild. So CNN is replaying clips from a George Conway podcast, which is an anti-Trump podcast. That's what CNN's doing now.
We have a court reporter, we have a videographer, they're entitled to a lunch break. You're here at Mar-a-Lago. What do you think you're going to do for lunch? Where are you going to get lunch? And so I said to him, well, I raised this question with your attorneys yesterday, sir, and they graciously offered to provide us with lunch. At which point there was a huge pile of documents, exhibits sitting in front of him, and he took the pile and he just threw it across the table. He looks at me from across the table and he says, see you next Tuesday. You could tell that it was like a kind of a joke, again, like teenage boys would come up with. And my colleagues are like, Robbie, do you know what that means? And I'm like, no, what are you talking about? They tell me, and I'm like, oh my God, thank God I didn't know, because had I known, I for sure would have gotten angry.
My panel is back.
So CNN cuts from that. I don't know if that happened or not, but it's a funny story.
With me.
So then they come back and they're going to have a whole panel on it, okay, from CNN. All right? Hey, let's talk about Trump. He said a mean phrase. He said some mean words. Okay, it's all demagoguery. It's all platitudes. They don't even talk about substance or policy. They're going to go on for 4 minutes talking about what Roberta Kaplan said on George Conway's podcast. That's CNN. It's so embarrassing. No wonder nobody watches them anymore, and they're on their way out. My friends, they're pathetic. We're going to be here continuing to cover their insanity. Hopefully you join us as we do. Don't forget to subscribe wherever it is you're watching this, my friends. Thanks for liking this video. Thanks for checking out robertgovea.com, grabbing a hat, looking good while you're watching the show, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you back here on the next one.